Hello, this is Dr. Golding, and we're going to continue our discussion today of John Stuart Mill's theory of utilitarianism. Now, before we continue with our discussion, I just want to make a point that the principle of utility is the same thing as the greatest happiness principle. They're just different names for the same fundamental principle that John Stuart Mill believes in. So sometimes it's called the principle of utility, sometimes it's called the greatest happiness principle, sometimes his theory is called utilitarianism. Okay, it's all different ways of saying the same thing. So thus, for example, the chapter in your book, which has a selection from John Stuart Mill's writings, is called the greatest happiness principle. But again, it's the same thing as the principle of utility. Meaning by this, that according to Mill, the fundamental moral principle, the single rule, which is the basis of morality, is that one should always act in such a way as to promote the greatest amount of happiness in society at large. Of course, given one's options. Sometimes your options aren't very good. But you're supposed to, according to Mill, what's morally right to do is always to seek to promote the greatest amount of happiness in society at large and to avoid causing unhappiness. And the more happiness you cause, the better your action is. The more unhappiness you promote by your action, the worse morally your action is. So let me just say a little bit about the word utility. The word utility simply means usefulness or productivity. Usefulness or productivity. So the idea is that your action is judged morally by what is its utility, what is it promoting, what is it causing, what is it going to bring about, what is going to be the benefit to society overall of your action. If there is a great benefit, then it's a good action. If there's not such a great benefit, then it's not such a good action. Okay, the more you promote, the more you cause or bring about social happiness, the better your action is. Again, so the word utility simply means usefulness or productivity. Now, this is related to, I just want to go over one thing we did talk about, which maybe was a couple times ago perhaps, is the term consequentialism. Let me just remind you about that term and its meaning. I'll put it over here. Consequentialism. Consequentialism is the view which Mill has that one should judge the moral worth of an action by what it promotes, what it causes, what are its consequences. Okay, so Mill is considered a consequentialist because he believes that you judge the moral worth of an action by what it promotes, what it produces, what are its consequences. Now, according to Mill, the relevant consequence is social happiness. Is your action promoting social happiness or not? Okay, now today, what we're going to do is talk about what Mill regards as some of the advantages of his theory. We're going to talk about a couple of questions that Mill raises in a way against his own theory and how he answers them. And we're also going to get into Mill's discussion of whether he can prove that the principle of utility is true. Okay, and I put that with a question mark because, as we'll see, Mill says that in a way it's impossible to prove the principle of utility. Or indeed, it's really impossible, he thinks, to prove any attempt to give a fundamental moral principle is destined to be incapable of proof. Okay, we'll get to that toward the latter part of today's lecture. So right now, let's talk about some advantages of Mill's theory, or at least what he considers to be advantages of his theory. Now, remember that according to Mill, again, the relevant consequence is social happiness, and Mill has claimed that what he means by happiness here is pleasure, right? And we talked last time about how Mill believes that there's not only physical or lower kinds of pleasures, there's also higher pleasures, or there's a higher kind of pleasure which we called mental pleasure. Same thing with pain. There's physical pain, there's also mental pain. Okay, so the idea again is that you're supposed to be promoting what's moral to do, what's morally right to do, is try to promote as much pleasure as possible in society, particularly mental pleasure as well as physical pleasure, and to avoid causing mental and or physical pain. Now, one of the advantages that Mill regards to be true of his theory is the idea that this principle is something that is practical and also measurable. Practical and measurable. These two things go hand in hand. Now, let me put those on the board. Practical, measurable. In other words, pleasure is something that we are familiar with. It's not some kind of mystical concept. We're not talking here about, if you remember Plato's theory of the soul and psychic harmony, Aristotle talked about the telos of the human being. Aquinas brings in God and the next world as part of his discussion of at least theological virtue, right? So Mill would say that his theory has an advantage. It's very, let us say, down to earth. It's very practical and measurable. In other words, you know when you're causing pain to people. You can measure pain in a way, right? You can see that causing, let's say, maiming someone causes pain. Slapping someone on the wrist causes pain, but maiming someone causes a lot more pain, right? If someone is hungry and starving and they're in pain and you give them some food, they feel better, they get pleasure from eating and from satisfying their hunger. So this is a very down-to-earth, practical, and measurable principle that we can use to really determine what is right or wrong. Okay, so that is what he claims to be one of the advantages of his theory. In addition, he goes on to say that the principle of utility can be used by a government to determine what laws to enact. Okay? In other words, governments have to decide what laws they should put into practice. Well, according to Mill, the way to make a decision about whether a certain law is or is not going to be the right thing to do, a morally good law is going to be a law which promotes the happiness of society at large. Okay, so for example, if we can determine that by collecting taxes from everybody, we can then institute, let's say, public education. And we know that for most people, public education is something that really brings about great benefit. It helps them to, let's say, learn and maybe learn a trade and go to college and get a job. Okay, so then that turns out to be a morally right thing for society to do. Any law which will promote the happiness of the society at large is going to be a morally good law. And a law which brings about pain for most people or all people, a law which promotes social unhappiness, is going to be a bad law. So, again, this is measurable and practical. Practicable is another word to use here. You can put it into practice. It doesn't require belief in God. It doesn't require belief in teleology. What is the ultimate purpose of mankind? We don't need to worry about that, according to Mill, to figure out what is morally right or wrong. So this is a very down-to-earth, practical, practicable, measurable theory about what morality truly is. You can theoretically figure out by taking some kind of a poll. It's a scientific question, in other words, right? or maybe a social science question as to whether a given policy is going to be something that promotes the happiness of society at large or doesn't. You can take a poll or do studies and see whether some policy or action is going to promote happiness for society at large or not. Because again, happiness means pleasure. Pleasure is something readily identifiable and measurable, and therefore it is a theory that is practical and practicable. Okay, so that is one of the advantages that Mill regards for his theory. Now, there are a couple of questions or criticisms that crop up focused on this idea that it is a measurable theory. Okay, so Mill is aware that, hey, wait a second, let's think carefully about this. Is this really a practical and measurable theory, or a theory that allows us to put into practice very straightforwardly our social policy? So here's some questions that we're going to talk about. Questions or criticisms. And these are questions or criticisms that Mill himself considers and he tries to answer. So first of all, I'm not going to be able to put all of these criticisms and questions on the board, but if you want to take notes, that would be a great thing. First of all, sometimes it might happen that you have two options, but both options are going to bring about the same amount of happiness or pleasure for society at large. I mean, that can happen. It does happen, right? You might have a situation where let's talk about a very, very simple example. Suppose that I'll give you a very simple example. Suppose I have a basketball which was signed by LeBron James, okay? And I really am not a big basketball fan, but somehow I got a hold of this basketball signed by LeBron James. Now, I have two friends, and both of them are avid basketball fans, and both of them happen to be fans of LeBron James. And I'm thinking, it would be a nice thing. I'm not really enjoying the basketball. It doesn't mean that much to me. And I'm thinking, I really want to give this basketball away to a friend who would really enjoy having it. So actually, according to Mill, it turns out that it's going to be morally good or right for me to do this, because I'll be maximizing, causing more happiness in society at large if I indeed give away the basketball to someone who's really going to enjoy it. All right, so let's suppose that that's true, right? That I'm not really enjoying it, but if I give it to someone who really does enjoy having the basketball, I'm going to be increasing happiness in society at large. Now, by that is meant, of course, even if just one person is happier because I give him the basketball, then the total net gain of happiness in society is increased, because that guy is a member of society. I'm not really diminishing my happiness that much by giving away the ball. So when I give away the ball, I'm actually doing something morally praiseworthy, according to Mill. All right, now here's the question. I have two friends. All right, let me go back to my example. I've got two friends, and they're both basketball fans. They're both LeBron James fans. And now I have a question. Who do I give the ball to? Well, if I could figure out that one of them really, really is going to be so happy, and the other guy is going to be like, well, man, it's okay, great, you gave me a ball from LeBron James, he's not going to be as happy, then the answer is clear. I should give it to the one who it's going to make him more happy. All right, that would be the right thing to do, according to Mill. But let's suppose that they equally enjoy, they would equally enjoy having the ball, okay? I can't really determine any difference as to who's going to enjoy it more. So now I'm stuck. It seems like Mill's principle does not give me an answer to the question as to what I should do. So therefore, it's not practical in this question. In this case, it doesn't give me a practical answer about what I should do. All right, now that's going to happen. Maybe my example is a little silly, but I think it's somewhat realistic. You can imagine lots of cases where doing one action is going to cause pleasure or happiness for someone, but it's going to cause pain for somebody else. On the other hand, if you do a different action, it's going to cause pleasure and happiness, which Mill thinks is the same thing, right? It's going to cause pleasure and happiness for person A, but it's going to cause pain to person B. So in that case, it looks like Mill's principle is not practical. Okay, that is one criticism, one question. And now let's talk about what Mill might say in response, or what Mill actually does say in response. What he says in response is that that's not a fault in the principle. That's what we call a moral dilemma, okay? Moral dilemmas, so here's this term, a moral dilemma. Okay, a moral dilemma is a situation where you have two choices and both of them are going to cause the same amount of happiness or unhappiness in society, but maybe to two different people or two different sets of people, right? You can imagine a policy or a law which, if put into practice, is going to have this same kind of effect. It's going to cause maybe a lot of happiness for one group, but a lot of unhappiness for the other group. Now, if on balance, more happiness is caused by one action than another, then you should do that one. But sometimes it happens that we have a moral dilemma. A moral dilemma is a situation where you have two options, they're different, but they're going to cause the same amount of unhappiness or unhappiness in society, but for different groups of people, or maybe for two different people. Now, Mill would say that that is not a flaw in his theory. That is just life. Life sometimes presents us with difficult and puzzling situations in which there is no real preference or no real reason to think that one option is better than the other. Okay, so what Mill would say in that case is, give the ball to whoever you want. It doesn't matter. You can flip a coin. You could just decide arbitrarily that you want to give it to this guy as opposed to the other guy. Now, you should give it to one of them, okay? Because at least you'll be making him happier, and the other guy, he might be a little bit unhappy. Maybe if he doesn't know about it, that's the best thing. You don't have to tell him that, hey, I'm giving this ball to somebody else. I could have given it to you, but I flipped the coin and he won. You don't have to say anything, right? So you don't want to cause any unnecessary unhappiness. But the fact that sometimes two different actions, you can't do both of them, right? See, I gave you the example of the ball because obviously you don't want to cut the ball in half and give each half to the two guys. That wouldn't make sense because then, you have half a ball. That's not very nice. And that would ruin the value of the ball, obviously, right? So you can't cut the ball in half and give a little bit to each. Now, if you have a candy bar, right? If you have a candy bar and you have two kids, you have only one candy bar, and both kids want the candy bar, then in that case, you break the candy bar in half and give each kid a half. That would be a good way to resolve that dilemma. But again, in the case of the ball, Mill would say, that's not a flaw in the principle. That's just the way life works. Life sometimes presents us with situations where we have moral dilemmas. And you just do the best you can, and in some cases you may even have to decide arbitrarily just what to do. Okay, so you can think, I happen personally to think that that's a good response. The flaw is not in the principle. The flaw is in life, you might say. Sometimes, as the old saying goes, life sucks. Sometimes that's true. You're just stuck with a situation where you're going to make one person happy, the other person unhappy, or do something else, make the other guy happy, the other guy unhappy. That's not a flaw in the principle, that's just the way the cookie crumbles, so to speak. Okay, that was one question or criticism that that Mill considers and tries to give an answer to. Here's another criticism is that it seems that it is going to be very difficult to really put Mill's principle into practice, because Mill's principle would demand that anytime you're about to make a decision, you should figure out what is going to be the impact on society at large by my action. Okay, in other words, like if I have to decide whether or not to lift my pen like this, okay, I should be thinking, wait a second, is lifting my pen going to cause happiness in society at large, or is it not? Is it going to make the students happier if I do this, or if I keep myself as stiff as possible? So, and then I begin to start thinking about how every single movement, every single motion that I'm about to make, is that going to make society happier or not happier? And I'm going to have to investigate and consider the long-term consequences of my action, and wonder whether, am I doing this YouTube video, is this really going to make more people more happy, or is there going to be some kind of negative consequence down the line that is going to be causing pain for people here? Basically, the criticism here is that the putting into practice of the principle of utility is impossible, because that means every time you have to make a decision, and we're making decisions every day, all day. We're making little decisions and sometimes big decisions. So how it surely you can't expect. There's really kind of two issues here. One is it's too much to expect of human beings. It doesn't seem, you're telling me that this principle is practicable and it gives us a guide for life. Well, it's not going to be something that every single moment of the day I can be thinking, is this going to make more people more happy? So I see there's two issues here. One issue is that this is too demanding. This is too demanding to expect of people that they think about the principle of utility every time they are going to choose to act. And second of all, even if people did, even if somehow I was able to consider that, okay, is this action going to cause more happiness or not? Even if I could do that, it would seem to be very difficult to figure out the answer in every case as to whether this is or isn't going to cause happiness for society at large. How can I know? I mean, some things are pretty obvious, right? If I take a machine gun and go shoot up a school, God forbid, then obviously that's going to cause unhappiness. Okay. But in general, it's going to be not so easy to figure out what are the consequences of my actions on society at large. So even if I could do that, it would be difficult to figure out the answer in every situation. So that is a criticism, or at least a question, that attacks Mill's claim that the principle is, as we said, practicable and gives us a measurable, useful way of deciding what is moral or immoral. Okay, so to those questions, Mill responds as follows. Okay, so Mill says a couple of things. One is that we have to go back to something we talked about last time, or maybe the time before, that Mill says that the principle of utility is the fundamental moral principle. Remember that? The principle of utility is the primary principle of morality. It's the one that doesn't have exceptions. It's the one that underlies all of what we call secondary moral rules. Now, the secondary moral rules are things like don't kill, don't steal, don't cheat, don't lie, give charity, hold the door open for people when they're coming in with big packages, help people who are in distress, give charity, be a nice person in general, smile at the doorman, things like that, okay? Meaning those are secondary moral rules. There's sometimes going to be exceptions, right? There's sometimes are exceptions when you should cheat, when you should lie, even when you should kill, unfortunately, like in self-defense. Okay, so the secondary moral rules are also known as rules of thumb. Rules of thumb. Okay, what is meant by, you probably heard this phrase before, rules of thumb. Okay, now what is meant by a rule of thumb is that it's a rule that you can generally rely upon, but every now and then you have to make, or you should make, exceptions. But in general, you can rely on those rules as a rough guide to how you should act. So here's what Mill says. Look, the fundamental principle is what I said. Always try to make more people more happy, promote social happiness in general, right? But human beings have been around for a long time, okay? We've been around for thousands or millions of years. And so according to Mill, what he would say is, over time, human beings have accumulated a lot of knowledge and wisdom about what sorts of actions make people happy and what actions don't make people happy. So that's what the secondary moral rules are. The secondary moral rules are rules of thumb. We can rely on those rules in general, for the most part, to guide our actions. So I know intuitively, or maybe it's not intuitive, I know based on experience, based upon the fact that I've been around for a while, that human beings have been around for a while, we, society, has a collective knowledge that killing, cheating, maiming, stealing, insulting, enslaving, torturing, those things cause unhappiness for people, right? And we also know that telling the truth and being honest and paying back your loans, overall society is going to be happier if people behave in that way. So therefore, as a guide to my actions, on a general basis, on a day-to-day basis, I can rely on those rules of thumb. I can rely upon those rules to guide my behavior. So I'm not stealing, I'm not cheating, I'm not lying, I'm not killing, at least right now I'm not doing any of those things, and I don't plan on doing any of those things later today either, okay? In general, I'm relying on those rules. So when I lift my pen up or don't lift my pen up, or do this or don't do that, use my hands, don't use my hands, put my hands behind my back, okay, so I'm not going to worry about that, because that's like, I'm not stealing, I'm not cheating, I'm not killing. And so therefore, I'm not going to worry about little petty actions and try to figure out, is this going to promote happiness or not? I'm relying on the rules of thumb, the general rules of thumb, the secondary moral rules to guide my behavior, and that's what all human beings can do. They don't have to, every time they act, try to take into account, okay, right now, whether I do this action, is this going to promote or not promote? They don't have to do that, because unconsciously, we are basically obeying the secondary moral rules, and for the most part, that is going to be behaving in such a way as to promote the social happiness, the greater happiness of the greatest number, and to not promote unhappiness. That's part of his answer to that question. Okay, now another aspect of his answer to the question, okay, is this too much to expect of people? Remember we said that. This seems like you can't expect, you can't demand that people always start thinking about the happiness of society every time they act. Well, what he says with regard to that is that as long as you're obeying the secondary rules, you're going in general to be promoting the happiness of society at large. And there's another thing, which is do the best you can. In other words, Mill is going to say his principle is, it is a demanding principle. To really put this into practice and to always act in such a way as to promote the happiness of society at large, it is a demanding principle to really live up to that. But it's an ideal. It's what people ought to do. Of course, there are going to be people who don't live up to this ideal at all. There are going to be people who fail. There are going to be people who cause unhappiness. That's true. It's not easy to be morally perfect, but it's an ideal to live up to. So do the best you can. Try. Of course, you're going to fail every now and then and cause unhappiness. And let's talk about that a little bit. Let's suppose, a person might say, well, I can't do this. It's too hard. I see that my actions, I end up causing unhappiness to a lot of people sometimes. What am I supposed to do? So Mill would say, you know what? A, do the best you can. And B, if you do cause unhappiness, there is something that you should do, which is apologize and make amends. Apologize and make amends. What do I mean by this? I think we all know about this, right? If you hurt someone's feelings, if you insulted someone, if you did something that caused somebody unhappiness, whether you did it intentionally or whether you did it by accident, what are you supposed to do? Apologize. We haven't talked about. There's actually a whole literature, not liturgy. There's a whole literature. Actually, there is a liturgy of apology too. But anyway, there's a literature on the nature, the moral nature of apologizing. Why is apologizing so important? Well, Mill has an answer to that question. Why is apologizing the morally right thing to do? If you hurt someone's feelings, if you caused unhappiness to somebody, then when you apologize and make amends, now by making amends, that depends on the situation. Let's suppose you damage someone's property. Okay, so making amends then means paying back monetary restitution. If you caused monetary damage, you made someone unhappy by causing damage to their property, that's a kind of unhappiness. So then how do you fix that? Well, you give them money to restore the damage, to pay back for the damage that you caused. Now, why is that morally right? It's morally right because now you are making the person less unhappy than they were. If someone insults you and then they apologize, it makes you feel better, at least a little bit, right? And if you were damaged, if your property was damaged or something bad happened to you that caused you unhappiness and the person pays damages, that helps restore your happiness. So apologizing and making amends is the right thing to do when you mess up. And that follows from the greatest happiness principle, that it is the right thing to do in general. Okay, so I got a little bit off the track there with talking about the morality of apologizing, but the point really was, okay, let's go back to the objection. The criticism was, hey, you can't expect people to do this all the time. It's too demanding. How could I be expected to live up to this principle of always seeking to make people happy all the time? It's too much for me to do. I'm going to fail. Answer, A, it's an ideal to live up to. It is hard. We're talking about what would be the morally right thing to do, and sometimes it's difficult. True. You can rely on the secondary moral principles as a guide, but in those cases where you might have some question about whether cheating or lying is the right thing to do because I'm not sure if it's causing more happiness or unhappiness. Okay, so in that situation, you can rely on the secondary moral rules. If the secondary moral rules don't give you a clear-cut answer, do the best you can, and if you mess up, and cause unhappiness or more unhappiness than you could have caused by doing a different action, then the thing to do is apologize, make amends. That's all we can expect of human beings. So I think the general point here is that these criticisms that I've been talking about, there are other criticisms of Mill's principle of utility, which we're going to get to. There are other criticisms of Mill's principle, and we're going to get to them. However, the criticisms that I've been talking about now focus specifically on the practicality and the measurability, and is this really something we could put into practice? That claim of Mill. The criticisms we've been talking about so far focus on that, and what Mill is saying is rely on the secondary moral rules, do the best you can, this is an ideal to live up to, not everyone is going to make it all the time, morality is not always so easy to live up to. That's the nature of morality. That's not a flaw in his principle. That's not a flaw in his theory. That is a flaw in human beings, or it's something that has to do with just life. Life sometimes presents us with difficult challenges. We have dilemmas. We have situations where we're not sure what to do. We have situations where we mess up. Do the best you can, and if you fail, apologize and try to make amends. Okay, that concludes, really, I would say, the first half or maybe 2/3 of this lecture, because we're going to go on now to something really important, which involves the issue of what proof, if any, can Mill give for his greatest happiness principle. Now, before we get into this, actually, I think it was 2 times ago that we did talk about an argument that in a way Mill gives for his principle known as the common denominator argument, okay? So I just want to review that for a minute. The common denominator argument, the common denominator argument is really not Mill's main attempt to prove the principle of utility. The common denominator argument was, let's just review that for a minute. The common denominator argument was that if you made a list, if we together were to make a list of all the do's and don'ts that we think morality is made up of, give charity, help friends in distress, do not cheat, do not lie, do not steal, do not kill, do not maim, do not torture. Okay, if we made a list of all the do's and all the don'ts, and then we ask ourselves, what do they all have in common? Well, all the do's have in common that they tend to promote more happiness for more people more of the time, and all the don'ts have in common that they tend to make people, if you disobey them or break those don'ts, you tend to make people more unhappy more of the time, right? So the common denominator argument is that the common denominator of all moral do's is promote social happiness. The common denominator of all moral don'ts is that they help us to not promote unhappiness. And so therefore, if that's what they have in common, then presumably that's the principle that is underlying them, okay? Now actually, Mill says that that's not, well, what he says is that there's really no possible proof for the principle of utility, okay? The common denominator argument is weak because, first of all, maybe there's something else that they all have in common, and second of all, lots of things could have something in common sort of by accident, but that's not the real reason for why they are true. In any rate, Mill says that if you're going to ask him to prove the principle of utility, it's going to be, in a way, impossible. It is impossible to prove what should be the ultimate end of society. Now, it's interesting, he uses this term ultimate end. And by the way, I'm going to pick up my book here because the argument that I wanted to go through in some detail, and I think maybe I'll have to save this for next time. I think what we'll do is today I'll talk about the argument, well, maybe we'll just read through the passage together. So if you have your book, in my book it's on page 169. This little selection from Mill is actually at the very end of the editor's preface to your chapter on Mill. Okay, so in my book, it's chapter 12. The chapter on Mill is chapter 12. And in my book, I'm looking at page 169. There's some small print before you get to the actual selection from Mill's writings. This small print is taken from Mill's writings as well, okay? All of this comes from the essay or the book known as Utilitarianism. That's the title of the book, okay? So, and there's even a footnote, you'll notice, criticizing something about the proof. But let's read together what Mill says here about his inability. He's admitting that in a way it's impossible to prove the principle of utility, but then he goes on to, in a way, sort of give a proof. Okay, this is kind of interesting. He says, you can't really prove it, it's impossible to prove, but I'll give you a proof anyway. Okay, it's a little bit bizarre, but let me look at this together with you. I think what we'll do is we'll look at the text, and next time we'll go through the proof in more detail and sort of pick it apart. But he says like this, to be incapable of proof by reasoning is common to all first principles. To be incapable of proof by reasoning is common to all first principles. So a first principle is something like the principle of utility. It's something very basic. It's something, let's call it axiomatic. An axiom is something that it's so basic that it's impossible to prove. To the first premises of our knowledge as well as to those of our conduct. Okay, in other words, let's suppose by the first premises of our knowledge, he seems to mean something like, let's say something like a logical rule that what is and what isn't is not. Okay, imagine if someone asked you to try to prove that that which is and that which is not is not. It's something so basic that you either accept it or you don't. That seems to be what he's saying. So that would be a first premise of knowledge. A first premise of our conduct would be, by that would mean something like a fundamental moral principle. A fundamental moral principle is so basic that it's going to be something that you either accept it or you don't. You can't really prove it. Now, what he says about the former, meaning he goes on to say like this, the former being matters of fact may be the subject of a direct appeal to the faculties which judge a fact, namely our senses and our internal consciousness. When it comes to something that's a fact, like 1 + 1 = 2, or what is and what is not, something like that, you can sort of say, look, don't you see that the chair, if it exists, it is, and that which is not the case. You know, you can say something like, I mean, if this is an eraser, well, this eraser is, right? This eraser has existence, and the fact that it is an eraser means that it's an eraser. I mean, you can look at it and see that it's an eraser and it's not an elephant, right? You can see with your eyes, with your senses, that the eraser is an eraser and the eraser is not an elephant. So when it comes to something like what is and what is not, you can appeal to the senses to make your little argument. But when it comes to morality, when it comes to something like what we ought to do, all right, how am I going to prove that you or we or society ought to do something? I can prove that we are doing something, right? I can take you out and show you that this is what people are doing. But if I'm going to be trying to convince you that this is what we ought to do, how am I going to be able to convince you that that's what we ought to do? Now, this reminds me of a little discussion we had regarding Aristotle. And Aristotle said that the way you try to argue that someone should do something is by appealing to some end that they may have, and then arguing that, well, listen, if you have this end, this is what you should do. So, for example, Aristotle and Mill would agree that let's suppose I know that you have an end of becoming a doctor. Let's suppose I know that you have that as a goal. All right, so I can then argue that you ought to go to college, and you ought to go to medical school, and you ought to work hard and get good grades so that you can get into medical school, and you ought to study for the medical boards to get into medical school, or the MCAT, or whatever that test is called, right? So if I know that you have certain ends, I can then argue this is what you ought to do, this is what you ought not to do. But eventually, we have to think about what is the ultimate end. Why do you have that end? Suppose someone says, well, I don't want to be a doctor. Okay, well, then I'm not going to be able to argue that you ought to go to medical school. Okay, so how, if we can argue for intermediate ends based on the assumption that people have certain other ends or goals that those intermediate ends are going to feed into or promote. But when it comes to morality, we're trying to figure out, well, what ought people to do? Well, Mill's going to say, I believe that there's an ultimate goal that society should promote, and that goal is social happiness. How am I going to be able to prove that that's what society ought to do? It's not like there's some other goal behind that goal, which is then going to explain why people should promote social happiness, because then that goal would be the ultimate goal. So here's Mill. He's claiming that the ultimate end of society, the ultimate goal by which we should judge whether our fellow human beings' actions are good or bad, the ultimate end is social happiness. But how is he going to be able to prove that? It's going to be impossible. It's incapable of proof. So let me put this little phrase down as a slogan. Ultimate ends are incapable of proof. Ultimate ends are incapable of proof. And so therefore the principle of utility is going to be incapable of proof. You're either going to accept it or you're not going to accept it. However, having said that, he then goes on to make a little argument that this really is the ultimate end of society, that this should be the highest goal, so to speak, by which we judge whether a person's action is right or wrong. So let's read through this paragraph together. The only proof capable of being given that an object is visible is that people actually see it. Okay, that sounds right. You can prove that something is visible only if people are able to see it. If people can't see it, then you can't prove that it's visible. The only proof that a sound is audible is that people hear it. And so of the other sources of our experience. Okay, if I make a claim that a certain sound is audible, then the only way I'm going to be able to prove that is if I can actually produce a situation where somebody hears that thing and then say, aha, I proved that it was audible. Okay, in like manner, I apprehend, this is Mill talking, in like manner, I apprehend the sole evidence it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people do actually desire it. Okay, so he seems to be saying there's an analogy between visible and desirable. If you want to prove that something is visible, you have to show that people can see it or actually do see it. If you want to show that something is desirable, then you have to show that people in fact do desire it. If the end which the utilitarian doctrine proposes to itself were not, in theory and practice, acknowledged to be an end, nothing could ever convince any person that it was so. Okay, in other words, if there's no way, or let's put it this way, if people don't acknowledge social happiness as the end, then there's not going to be any proof to show that it should be the end. So he says as follows, look at this last sentence in this paragraph. No reason can be given why the general happiness is desirable, except that each person, insofar as he believes it to be attainable, desires his own happiness. So he's claiming something like this. Look, it is a fact that people want to be happy. Every individual in society, he says each person, so he's talking on an individual level here, each person desires to be happy. And so therefore, in some way it follows that society as a whole desires social happiness. That's just a fact. I desire my happiness, you desire your happiness, he or she desires her happiness. If you put us all together in one big group, as a group, what do we all want? We all desire social happiness. So therefore, in a way, in fact, it's true that that is the only end that we desire as a group is social happiness. And so therefore, in a sense, we have actually proven that that is the ultimate end of society. Social happiness is the highest goal, so to speak. And so therefore it follows that the principle of utility is true, that since that's the ultimate end of society, we all therefore should promote that end. Okay, that is the, again, he says the principle is incapable of proof, then he sort of gives an argument for it. He's kind of admitting that it's not really a convincing argument. So what I'd like you to do is look at that footnote. There is a footnote in the text regarding a little criticism or perhaps a flaw in this argument. This argument has raised a lot of criticisms. It's generated a lot of discussion. And so I think what we'll do is bring this segment to an end. What I'm going to ask you to do is look over that passage, look at the footnote, think about whether you agree or disagree with this argument, and in our next video lecture, if you have any questions, if anything is unclear, please email, call me. I'll be happy to try to respond to your questions. Otherwise, have a great, healthy, happy, safe week. Bye-bye.